I thank the gentlelady for yielding. And it's an honor to be here on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus to address these issues and speak to these issues because they're so timely. And there's new developments that come every day with these that, keep us guessing as to what the Trump administration is going to do from one moment to the next. I'm going to talk about this plane from Qatar towards the end, but I did want to speak today, Mr. Speaker, about my deep concern about the appropriations and budget processes as established by the Constitution, because they're broken. I rise out of deep concern for our institution, our responsibilities, and for the American people who elected us to make decisions. The continuing resolutions that we've been passing are temporary stopgaps, but they've become the norm. And it's not just a failure of a process, it's a failure of President Trump's leadership and House Republican leadership. Trump's economic failures include trying to make his tax cuts permanent, the DOGE cuts, and the irresponsibility of the tariff packages, which thank goodness he backed away from that a few days ago with respect to cutting a deal with China. But that's only for 90 days. And the challenge of the erratic and illegal behavior he's been exhibiting is that it really puts companies in a very difficult spot. Companies have to make decisions not just moment to moment, as apparently President Trump does, but over months, sometimes years, especially if they're going to make major decisions about something like, say, investing to build a new plant, because that can cost millions or even billions of dollars. And so when he does things like he puts up 130-something% in tariffs against one of the main trading partners of the United States, like China, it creates a major problem for companies who do trade with China, who get their materials or send their finished products to China. And many of those are American small businesses, and we've seen and heard from many of those over the past couple of days. Some are toy manufacturers that I've been listening to as they talk about what's happened to their companies on the radio, and they're concerned about what might happen for them at the key time of year for their businesses, which would be the Christmas holidays. But the Trump administration didn't pay any attention to that. In fact, he just moved forward with the tariff cuts, or the tariffs that he put in place, not just against China, not just against our adversaries, but against allies like Canada and Mexico, France, Germany, and other countries. And it's been devastating to the American economy and businesses across the country. He ran for election telling the American people that he was going to make their economic lives better, that he was going to help them financially be better off than they were under the Biden administration. But it's clear in the first 6 months of what he's been doing that he's not putting money in their pockets, he's taking it out. And I think it's critical for us to make sure we understand fully what's going on here with respect to the packages that they're trying to move. He's trying to do it mainly through executive order. He's been unable to move major pieces of legislation through the House, and House leadership hasn't pressed him to do it, even though we're supposed to be doing these things through the appropriations process. Matter of fact, the Constitution gave us the obligation to move these bills through the appropriations process, but the Republican leadership in the House has failed to do that. And the failure to pass these appropriations bills has led to things like federal workers. They're being forced out of their positions. Some of them are being concerned about whether their paychecks are going to come. Small businesses, as we just mentioned a moment ago, especially those that are relying on government contracts, are having trouble making payroll. And in some of those instances, they've already done the work that they're supposed to get paid for. But the Trump administration has done two things. One is it's withdrawn contracts, but it's also, even though they perform the work, refused to make the payments and force some of these companies to shut down and fire some of their employees, even though they already did the work. And we're also going to have challenges, I think, too, with respect to communities who've been hit by major disasters. Unfortunately, I just saw, while we were waiting to start this process a few minutes ago, we had 3 major natural disasters today across the country. But FEMA's under attack, and the funding is being cut. With respect to reconciliation, as we just talked about a moment ago, the $881 billion in cuts to Medicaid is a shocking development. We know that what that could mean for communities across the country is that hospitals have to shut down, medical treatment facilities might have to be closed, people who perform medical services like doctors and nurses might not be available. And certainly in urban areas and suburban areas like mine, there's going to be a major impact from that. But in red states and rural districts as well. I just heard a report on the radio last week. It was talking about a district in a rural area where their hospital runs, I think it said 70% of their funding comes through Medicaid in one way or another. And if these cuts are made, that hospital is going to have to close. And if that hospital closes, it creates essentially a medical desert going 200 miles each way. So the next time you have a serious car accident in that area, they're going to have a tough time getting people to the care that they need. Or any kind of medical emergency, say perhaps from a complication in a birth scenario, or basic day-to-day medical services, they're going to have to drive hundreds of miles in some instances just to go see a doctor. With respect to the impoundment issue, I want to raise that too, because the Trump administration has started making the argument that even though money's been appropriated, they don't have to spend it. And the reason they're trying to do that is because they want to take control away from Congress, the power of the purse that was given to Congress through the Constitution, and take control of that themselves. And they want to do that so they marginalize Congress and make the spending decisions that they want to make. And we saw that with the $1.6 trillion that the Trump administration decided how to spend that, because we didn't pass a regular appropriation set of bills. We had to do it through the continuing resolution. It left them discretion that I don't think that they should have. And I got to say, I'm concerned about the way he's used his discretion in some of these processes. Some of the budget cuts that they've made, for example, VOCA, Victims of Crime Act is what that stands for. Cutting grants to help people who are victims of crime. Why would he take a step like that? Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. That's to help women who are surviving sexual assault or domestic violence. Why would you cut a program like that? We cut USAID programs. That one of our colleagues referenced earlier about how that has had a positive impact on the starvation issues, the USAID efforts. But they're cutting programs that's going to lead to, I saw one estimate, 1.6 million people will die over the next year based on these cuts that he's making right now to foreign aid. We stopped funding AmeriCorps, which means less teachers in areas that are in desperate need of teaching assistants. We've got a lot of schools out there who are short on full-time teachers, certainly short on full-time certified teachers. Making cuts to AmeriCorps just exacerbates the problems. Cutting rental subsidies. That means that low-income families who have trouble keeping a roof over their head, the Trump administration is going to make it even harder for them to do that. Why would we take that step? And how is that consistent with the promise that he made to help American people who needed the help the most? Cuts to mental health services. We've got kids who are struggling in school. They're bullied sometimes. We've got some scenarios where you have serious violence attacks in the schools. And it might be a mass shooting from a gun situation. It might be something less serious than that. But we've got kids that need assistance with their mental health challenges across the country, and making cuts to those sorts of programs only makes it harder for these kids to survive and get through the school process. Cuts to NIH. Now, I know he had frankly, a vendetta essentially against Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. And he's taken that out on many of the health institutions like the NIH. But at the end of the day, it's clear that the NIH has been and continues to be, hopefully at least, if they can survive these cuts, one of the premier institutions that do medical research that makes a difference here in the United States and around the world. Medical research on cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. It's important to folks like me, and there's a lot of folks who are cancer survivors. And the only reason we're still here is because of the medical advances that were made at places like NIH based on research that was done using government funding. That's how these things happen. Alzheimer's is another one. My father died from Alzheimer's. It's one of the most horrific diseases you can possibly imagine. You would never even wish it on your worst enemy. It's hard to even explain how tragic it is to watch a human being slide from being the full person that they were into something ravaged by Alzheimer's. They cut funding for clinical trials for Alzheimer's at NIH. And the thing about clinical trials you need to remember, it's not like an off switch. You don't just flick it on and off and it comes right back. If you shut down a clinical trial, you might have to start that all the way from scratch. And in some instances, the research and the projects that have been going forward under that have taken years. So he's setting that back years, months. Why? Why would he do that? And then the cuts to grants to help people who want to go into these science fields. You know, the United States, certainly in the last 50 years and in the post-war era, has been the premier nation with respect to science and technology and innovation. That's how we got Apple, that's how we got Microsoft, that's why we have quantum computing. All of those fantastic innovations and giant steps forward came from the United States, in part because of the research that was funded, in part, by the federal government. And the people who developed many of those advances got their training, paid for their college, paid for their PhDs, using funding that helped them get through school. They wouldn't have been able to pay for it otherwise. Yet the Trump administration is making cuts not just to those programs, but also to the grants and funding that help those people get through. And to add insult to injury, the personal attacks on research institutions like Harvard, which has been a source of some of the best and talented, the best and the brightest that have taken leadership in these fields, he's making threats to undermine those institutions and those universities, just out of personal venom. It makes absolutely no sense. It's damaging to the United States. It undermines our leadership in science and technology in the world. It's almost like he says it's America first, but sometimes it feels like China first. Sometimes it feels like he's actually trying to help the Communist China Party leadership surge ahead of the United States in its leadership role in science and technology. And then $40 million in cuts for election security. Now, I know he still says he wins the 2020 election. Okay, fine. But, you know, one of the things that we can all agree on for sure is that we know the Russians and the Chinese, and in some instances, Iran and terrorist organizations around the country, or around the world, are making efforts to influence our election with misinformation and disinformation and the like. Why would we ever make our elections more vulnerable to those kinds of attacks by cutting the funding that helps defend against it? I'll stop with this on the plane. When I first saw that on the news, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like they were playing a clip from Saturday Night Live or something. I never imagined that the Trump administration or the Trump family would even consider taking a $400 million plane from a country like Qatar. Not exactly an adversary country, but certainly not an ally country. And even if they were, it's a foreign country. And the reason the Emoluments Clause was put in place in the Constitution was to make sure that presidents of the United States of America, whether it's number 1 or number 47, are not tempted or tested with these kinds of essentially bribes to try and get them to lean and issue support for their countries in making decisions. We want to make sure we have people like the President of the United States, not tested by the money, not tempted by the money, but always making the decisions for the best possible reasons in the best interest of the United States. But here we have $400 billion plane, and apparently he'll eventually own it personally. Now, tell me why that's beneficial for the country. Creates conflicts of interest, and then some, because we have all of these issues with Qatar, including the negotiations with the Gaza conflict. How is this going to be beneficial to the United States to create these levels of conflicts? Even if he could rise above them, the appearance of the conflicts is ridiculous. It's astonishing, and it's unacceptable. The National Review, not exactly a liberal rag, not exactly a liberal bastion, said the swamp is under new ownership. So much for the commitments that he made to the American people when he first ran and when he ran again to so-called clean up the swamp. Here we are. It violates the Constitution. I think on its face, he should know better. And I'm sure that everybody in the Congress, sometimes he needs guardrails. Okay, he always needs guardrails. This is the moment we've got to make sure we stand up and put the guardrails in place. So to my colleagues here in Congress, let's get back to work. Let's stand up and address this issue, the conflicts of interest with the plane. Let's make it clear that we unanimously oppose him taking the plane, certainly on the behalf of the United States, and certainly in his personal capacity, that we unanimously want to move forward with a budget that's fair and reasonable and helps the American people, not taking $881 billion out of their pockets, out of the pockets of kids, out of the pockets of seniors, out of the pockets of the disabled, the people who need it the most. We've got to make sure that when this budget process is done, we're protecting the people who need it the most. Right now, it looks like we're taking from the most vulnerable to give to the most wealthy, like Elon Musk and his allies. We've got to reverse that process. And so I want to commend the gentlelady for pulling this together, my colleagues with the Congressional Black Caucus, my colleagues in the Democratic Caucus, and hopefully colleagues in the Republican Caucus who will stand up and say, we can't do this, we cannot cross these lines. The plane is over the line, the $881 billion in cuts to Medicaid's over the line, the no more appropriations bills, that's over the line. Let's get back to work, let's engage in clear and proper oversight, and let's address these problems and do the work that helps the American people. And with that, I yield back to my colleague.